Oh, well, thank you everyone for joining us today. What a beautiful Monday we have here, at least in Sarasota. I know it's just amazing out here. But I want to say hello. My name's Carol White Evans, and I'm the Chemicals and the Environment Agent at the IFAS Extension in Sarasota County. I'm here today with my coworker, Sarah Bostic, who's on the other end on the road somewhere. But she's my teammate and my tag team in tag team teaching, as well as Mindy Hannick, who is here and doing an outstanding job of facilitating that chat box. In the shadows, who we've never really mentioned, is our Florida-friendly specialist, Wilma Hawley, who is extremely knowledgeable and often our go-to person on questions with Florida plants and pollinators. Our communication person is Kevin. He supports this series by getting all these videos loaded onto our website, as well as all the other technical aspects of this series. We also have that weekly blog. So, when we send out the MailChimp email, you'll have a link to that blog. But thank you for joining the Edible Gardening series today. We offer it every Monday from noon to about 1 o'clock now. Topic this week is spider mites. I'll spend about 15 to 20 minutes discussing that topic, and then we open it up for questions. And again, we monitor the chat box throughout, so if you have any questions either related to today's topic or to gardening in general, go ahead and put it in the chat box, and we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. So with that, this webinar series came from hearing from our county residents, as well as others, that they're pretty frustrated over trying to garden in Florida. Some of these are new to gardening, some have been here a while, or some have moved from another state. So gardening in Florida, as well as other locations we know, can be quite challenging, but hopefully this series is going to help the gardeners find success in your gardening efforts. This series grew out of that need for more information around gardening. And being an extension, we're always happy to offer any support we can to our community members. So with that, today's topic is spider mites. Spider mites are a big pest of garden and landscape, ornamental landscape plants. There are many types of spider mites, from microscopic mites that live in the soil, others that live on animals or even in stored grains. There are also those that are specifically attracted to like citrus trees and fruits, and then those that feed on our edible garden, ornamental landscape, as well as many of our weeds. So opposite these pest mites are the mites that feed on fungus and or plant pest mites, and these are our biological control mites. In all, most mites are highly specialized and will be found only in a particular place where they're adapted to living. Animal mites will not live on a plant, and like a blueberry bud mite can only live in a specific part of a specific plant. So they truly are usually highly specialized. However, today's session, we're going to focus on a mite that is capable of living and feeding on many different types of plants. This is a group of mites called the spider mites. These are in the ones that we'll talk about today are in the order, I always get this wrong, Tetranychidae. So we will spend a few minutes looking at biological control mites as well, the predatory mites in the fungicide. These usually go hand in hand with pest spider mites. So these are the good mites that control these bad mites. And once again, I get to interject information on biological, our natural enemies into my presentation. So, but first, a quick review of the group of organisms that we are describing, since we've only covered insects up to this point. So within the kingdom Animalia, we have the phylum Arthropoda. The common characteristics within that phylum is that they all have segmented bilateral bodies and jointed appendages. There are 4 classes within the phylum Arthropoda. So there's the arachnids, the crustaceans, insects, and myriapods. Like I said, the previous sessions, we've only focused on insecta. Those are the insects. But today we discussed the class Arachnidia. So this includes spiders, scorpions, ticks, and mites. So the most notable difference between arachnids, so within that class, is that the difference between arachnids and insects. Insects have wings where arachnids do not. Insects have 3 body parts. They have their head, their thorax, and their abdomen, where arachnids only have 2 body parts. So they have a combined head and thorax, which is called a cephalothorax. And then they also have abdomen. But also insects have 6 legs, and we know that spiders have 8 legs. However, mites are even a little bit more different than the rest of that group of arachnids. In mites, the 2 body parts are called the gnathostoma and the idiostoma. The gnathostoma is the head, but it's really only the mouth part. And then the idiostoma encompasses all the rest of the body. So really, when we're talking about mites, we're really worried about their mouth parts. So now, we're talking about spider mites today, but although they are called spider mites, they are not spiders, but they are actually mites. The reason behind the spider in the name is that they're in the family of mites that are web forming. So they spin a real thin, delicate, silken web. So mites have piercing, sucking mouth parts like thrips, and they damage plants by rupturing the cells in the leaf, and then they feed on those plant juices as they suck each cell dry. These plant-feeding mites cannot chew the plant, but they partially digest their food before they ingest it. One good thing is that spider mites are not known to transmit diseases to the plants that they're feeding on. So we've talked about whiteflies and aphids, which both can transmit diseases. So spider mites of the tetranylids are one of the most economically important genres of mites due to their high potential to destroy ag crops. This genus contains over 140 of the most significant, with the most significant being the 2-spotted spider mite, a Tetranychus urticae. But I'll call it 2-spotted spider mite because it's much easier. However, there are quite a few different mite species that are common in Florida gardens and often get grouped into the 2-spotted spider mites since they are extremely difficult to tell apart. Really, to tell the difference, you need to look at them underneath a microscope. These other spider mite species, which are common in our garden, are the T. gloveri, Evansii, and Tomediellus. So these all have a more limited host range than the 2-spotted spider mite, but each are common on the plants that the 2-spotted spider mite infest as well. So although there are many spider mites that are, plant pests here in Florida, as well as throughout the U.S., 2-spotted spider mite is probably the most well-known and problematic. This is due to the fact that it affects both our garden and our landscape ornamental plants. And it has a really large range of host plants. So basically, they are not at all picky feeders. So 2-spotted spider mite adults, as the name suggests, they have these 2 large, as you can see here, they have these 2 large dark spots on each side of the body. The color of those spots can change from light to dark, deep green. It depends on what they're feeding on. The spots, however, are not part of the body color, but it's a buildup of waste products that you actually can see through their body wall. So, however, the rest of the spider mite, the body, ranges anywhere from a pale green to a greenish amber color or even a yellowish. And since it is an arachnid, along with those 2 body parts, it has 4 pair of legs. The adult spider mite is about 1/2 millimeter long, so it's pretty small. And the males tend to be smaller than the females, and they usually start to narrow down towards the back end of the spider mite. They're typically more problematic during the dry times of the year. So here in Florida, we're usually, like Central Florida is usually April to June is our dry time. So this is when our spider mite populations are going to start to increase because it gets hot and it's dry. And that's the perfect scenario for a spider mite outbreak. So spider mites are usually found in the lower canopy, but they'll move higher up the canopy as their numbers and their population increases. Since they are an arachnid, they make these webs, which are really difficult to penetrate with a spray application. So if you're using a conventional, which I hope you're not, but even a biorational, a neem oil or a insecticidal soap, those are really hard to penetrate those webs because those webs are really good fortresses for those spider mites. Spider mites at low numbers can have these population explosions after either after you fertilize or if synthetic pyrethroids are being used, because synthetic pyrethroids have a real detrimental effect on the natural enemies that control the spider mites. So spider mites are usually kept in check by predatory mites as well as other natural predators, but we'll discuss predatory mites in just a minute. So for a quick mite life cycle, this is generalizing and it's really simplifying it, but most mite species develop by the female laying eggs. She lays eggs inside that silk webbing, but she also will lay them directly on the underside of the leaf. Once the eggs are laid, they usually take about 3 days to hatch. Eggs are transparent and they range in color from colorless to like a straw yellow or just a kind of a hazy color. Eggs are perfectly round. They're like tiny little shiny marbles. However, they are quite large when you compare the egg to the size of that adult mite. The first stage out of the egg is actually a 6-legged larva, but that larva quickly molts into an 8-legged nymph. So they go through another 2 or even 3 stages of this 8-legged nymph before it then reaches an adult stage. The complete life cycle from egg to adult can be really highly variable because it depends on the heat, the humidity, and the amount of food that's available. But under perfect conditions where it's hot and dry, right, and plenty of food, it can be as quick as 5 days. But then when it's cool and damp, it can take as long as 20 days. So the average life cycle, though, takes anywhere between 8 and 14 days to complete. So again, spider mites prefer dry weather, but they also like low relative humidity. So anywhere in that range of 30 to 60. So that's that prime humidity level for those spider mites. Spider mites, they mate pretty soon after emerging into their adult stage. And in warm weathers, those females can lay really quickly after they mate. Each female can lay about 100 eggs, actually over 100 eggs in her lifetime, and she can lay up to 19 eggs per day. And then mites usually live between 2 and 4 weeks, so you're going to have a lot of overlapping generations during those mite seasons. So, susceptible crops, right? 2 spotted spider mites have been reported to have over 300 host plants, and that includes over 100 cultivated species. So the preferred host plants from the garden are things like beans and tomatoes, cucurbits, mainly like cucumbers, squash, and melons, but they're also found on things such as beets, carrots, corn, parsley, and then as far as fruits are like blackberries and other fruits. Other like minor crops that are pretty susceptible are things like okra. Last week's talk of okra pops into my head, but okra, papaya, taro, and cotton are all also host plants to them. Spider mites are not very picky when it comes to their preferred host plants. As we've seen over and over again in this series, there are many different weeds that are host plants to pests. They usually use them to overwinter when the garden plants have started to decline. So year-round weed control is really important for gardeners. So we tend to desert our garden plots after season, right? We kind of like, set it and forget it. And we only deal with it just prior to the next gardening season. So in that time, many of those pest insects, or should I say arthropods, right? Because they're both insects and arachnids, they've already begun their spring reproduction on those existing weeds that are in that area. So even if you don't have time to pull weeds, at least mow or use a weed eater to keep those weeds from growing around your garden and from producing seeds. So this is going to make your life much easier, at that point and in the long run, especially when you don't allow them to produce seeds. So as far as susceptible flowers, well, I have a story about trying to control spider mites so I was a IPM manager at a 240 acre production mum farm. We did over 10 million cuttings a week. Well, That story is way too long for this session, but I just want to say two things. I managed to get control of insects after 10 months of intensive work, applying predatory mites as well as other natural enemies, and rotating applications of only biorational products. Of course, this was not possible without a huge influx of money, or a big infusion of money. So it's really important to be checking checking and monitoring all of your plants for spider mites, not just your edible gardening plants, especially those that you know are preferred hosts of these mites. And two of those favorite ornamental plants are roses and chrysanthemums, but they are also really fond of things like azaleas, camellias, hollies, pittosporum, and viburnums, all of which are very, very common in our landscape here in Florida. You can also find them in trees such as like maple, elm, and redbud trees. And so if you want to know more about my story of the spider mite infestation, I'm happy to tell it later when we have some time. So signs of spider mites. So spider mites and spider mite damage, I should say. We know that mites, such as the two-spotted spider mite, feed on plants by sucking that cell content, right, that plant sap from the leaf. What this does, causes a stippling on that leaf where the mites have literally drained that cell in a particular area. It's quite obvious and shows up as white spots on the leaf that eventually leads to like chlorotic. So a dying, chlorotic means, it drains all the color out of it. So it leads to a chlorotic yellowing or graying and a bronzing of the leaf. Leaves can become shriveled and dry, and then they can fall off the plant. Usually damage occurs first on the lower leaves, and then the spider mites move upward through the canopy as their populations increase. The underside of the leaf may have cast skins, right? Those are the exoskeletons of those mites as they have molted. And there's also going to be obvious signs of webbing on the foliage. In severe spider mite infestations, feeding can cause plants to lose vigor, they become stunted, and that whole plant can go into decline. So when you see an aerial photo, I unfortunately don't have one, but when you see an aerial photo of crops that have spider mite damage, you can see those isolated areas of damage due to the spider mites. Spider mites will often heavily damage one species of plant, and then they disperse to other hosts. When infestations are high, what they do, the webbing will cover all or part of the plant or the leaf, and it becomes really noticeable. As you can see here, we have a lot of webbing going on these plants here. The web allows the mites to travel from those infested to non-infested leaves. It also helps the mites to disperse. So when a plant is heavily damaged like that, these mites migrate to the outer edge of the plant. And from there, even like a slight breeze is going to catch them and carry them on, can carry them away a significant different distance to a new host plant. So the extent of damage caused by mites often depends on rainfall. As we talk about how they like dry and they like hot. So when rainfall is low, your mite populations are probably going to be really high. Damage is particularly severe during droughts, and presumably outbreaks are going to start getting worse as we have these changing climates, right? As our rainfall decreases. So now about the predatory mites. So predatory mites, the photocid mites, they are a family of mites that feed on thrips and other mite species. Some even prey on nematodes, and others can feed on fungus and pollen as well. They've been used as biocontrol since about the 1950s, and the numbers are just increasing of the different species that they find that help with biocontrol. You can tell them apart from spider mites fairly easily, since they have like this really robust teardrop-shaped body, as well as they have these really long legs. They tend to be the same size or slightly larger than the pest spider mites, and they're quite shiny in comparison to spider mites, though. And they also tend to be this reddish orange color. However, predatory mites do not create webs. nor do they have those two spots on the side of their body like the two-spotted spider mites. But the most noticeable difference between spider mites and predatory mites is their activity. These guys are fast and they are so much fun to watch. You can see if you have predatory mites on leaves by watching how quickly they can move across the leaf. They hunt down spider mites like with like just bullseye precision, and they do an amazing job of keeping spider mite populations under control. One of the ways predatory mites they find their prey is by means of the webbing. When predatory mites, specifically Persimmilus, is one of those species that is just only eats spider mites. When they find webbing, they literally pick up their pace and intensity in their hunt for those spider mites. So as soon as they come across that webbing, they know there's spider mites in the area. There are quite a few different species that you can purchase that are in our landscape, but that you can also purchase depending on what you need. For example, if you have a real severe outbreak of spider mites, then you're going to need to get Persimmilus, right? Because these are insane feeders of spider mites, and they only feed on spider mites. They can eat up to 5 adults a day, or they can eat several dozen eggs a day. So they're voracious eaters. But again, all they do is feed on spider mites. If you need predatory mites for like maintenance, you can also, there's quite a few that are maintenance mites. So you're going to, like Californicus is one of them, because they also feed on things like pollen and other small arthropods. So if you have a real small population of spider mites, then these things can actually eat other things while that population increases or until they find more spider mites to eat. So this group is so abundant that if you purchase predatory mites, you can also order mites. You can also order mites that will be successful at particular temperatures and humidity. So basically, you can get a predatory mite for whatever circumstance you need them for, depending on your temperature, your humidity, and your infestation levels. So there are quite a few places online that you can purchase them, and they're fabulous natural enemies and pest control for spider mites. So because predatory mites are still spider mites, they have the same general life cycle, but many people get concerned that they have spider mite eggs when it's actually predatory mite eggs that are on their plants. So the eggs of spider mites and predatory mites are quite easy to tell apart. As we've already mentioned, spider mite eggs are spherical and range in colors from like a transparent and even a colorless to an opaque straw yellow color. They lay them in the webbing or near the veins, which is usually and end on the underside of the leaf. However, the eggs of the predatory mites, they're opaque and white, and they're oval shaped. These are shaped more like what we think of normal eggs, which that we're familiar with, kind of like a chicken egg. They lay them in singly on the bottom sides of the leaf, right along the vein. There is never any webbing associated with these eggs because, remember, predatory mites don't web. So, biological control. So, although predatory mites are the primary control agents of spider mites, there are many other natural enemies that help control mites. So, all of them are generalist feeders, meaning that they're going to feed on whatever they come across as long as they're small and soft-bodied. Lady beetles, lacewings, predatory stink bugs are all really important natural enemies. And they also control other things like thrips and aphids and whiteflies. The interesting one to me are the predatory thrips. We tend to think of thrips as like a bad bug, but there are actually quite a few of them that are good bugs. Things like the six-spotted and the banded thrips are all species that feed directly on spider mite eggs, as well as the nymphs and the adult spider mites. All of these biological controls are common in the garden and the landscape, so it's really important for you to be practicing integrated pest management, right, to support and conserve these natural pest agents that are already, apparent in our garden. So for monitoring for spider mites, visual monitoring for spider mites is fairly straightforward. You want to look for fading leaves, right? They're starting to lose their color, especially on those older leaves. Look at the top of the leaves for that stippling, and then also look underside of the leaf for things like webbing. You can hold, here's another kind of thing, you can hold a piece of white paper underneath a branch, and then you gently tap on that branch. Those mites are going to fall onto the paper, and then you can verify that that pest is a spider mite using your hand lens, right? So indirect sampling methods, we've talked about the yellow sticky cards. Well, these are not effective monitoring things for mites because mites don't fly or they really don't move around that much. Observing the underside of the leaf with that hand lens, that 10x hand lens, and you're going to want to watch for those changes in that foliage that are characteristic to mite feeding. And again, that hand lens is really important. It's going to be the best dollar you've ever spent because it's really hard to see. You can really overlook spider mite when they're in lower populations because they blend really well into the leaves. So having that hand lens is going to be really important for your scouting. So, and then watch out for flare-ups. This is going to be happening if you're using things like synthetic pyrethroids. There are certain products that are those synthetic pyrethroids that are broad spectrum, and what they do is they kill off your beneficial insects. And so when those beneficial insects aren't around, you're going to get this massive flare-up of spider mites. So, you just want to be careful. And flare-ups will also happen, remember when we talk about when you do, like if you're over-fertilizing your plants. So prevention and control. So habitat management, important to keep the humidity levels high, above 65 is good. But temperatures should really be kept lower. This is obviously going to be a tricky part. So if it's hot and dry, you know that there's a good chance that you're going to have a spider mite infestation. So you're going to be wanting to monitor and scout your plants at least every other day. Mites like it dusty. So a daily hosing down of the plants will also help to keep them cool, and it'll clean them of any of those dust particles and those things that those spider mites really like. Be sure that you also spray the underside of the plant as well. This is going to also wash those spider mites off, as well as it's going to mess around with their reproduction and their feeding. So it's going to help you in that respect as well. And those water sprays are going to help conserve your natural enemies because you're not using even, at this point, you won't even be using biorational products to control your spider mite populations. So if you do find an area infestation, you have a very good chance of eliminating it before you find the webbing, right? So you want to be monitoring it quickly, but if you do find that webbing, the best thing for you to do is to prune that off, put it in a trash bag and throw it away, right? Never put those clippings around the side of the garden or in your compost because those mites are just going to crawl on out and reinfest your plants. If you keep the area around the garden and in the garden mulch, that's going to help keep down those dust particles, right? Those things that those mites love. And then beneficial insects. Attract and conserve beneficial insects. This means having alternative food sources for those adult insects, like your nectar feeders. So you can also purchase beneficial insects off the web, which is there's some really good resources for those. Another important thing is remember not to allow mites to hitchhike on your clothing in the garden. Good rule of thumb for any of those garden insects, if you're dealing with an infested plant, don't then just go work on a clean plant, right? You don't want to transfer those pest insects onto your uninfested plants. So think of it like washing, hand washing dishes. You always want to wash the cleanest dirty dishes first, right? That way you're not getting your water all messed up by those really dirty dishes. So when you're working with plants, start with your clean plants first and work towards your infested plants. With that said, wear white or light colored clothing in the garden, and that's going to help you to detect if those insects are on your clothes. And And also you want to remember, stay away from yellow and blue. Those are the colors that attract insects. So try to stick with white or other light colored clothes. And finally, if you have to turn to chemicals to control those mite infestations, insecticidal soaps, neem oils, and horticultural oils all work in tandem with beneficial insects to help fight that mite problem. These products also work really well on mite eggs, which is a great thing. And like always, make sure you're following your label instructions if you are turning to your mites. I wanted to show you here. This is called a sash. This is those when you purchase beneficial predatory mites, they're going to come in these type of things, these sashes, and you just hang them on the plants, and then they disperse out on their own. So with that said, I believe that is the end. This is our resource list for this week. It will also be in, it'll be on this PDF, but it will also be in the sent with the MailChimp email that we'll be sending out with our resource list. And thanks for joining the session today. And we hope to see you again next week, where we're going to be discussing tools for the garden.